Namaskara and welcome to BIC Talks, a podcast by Bangalore International Centre.
So what the pandemic has also taught us is that, everyone's lived off delivery. All the middle class has lived off delivery people, bringing food to their home or groceries to their home. I hope they've realized that they couldn't have done, without the delivery people. I'm hoping the pandemic will actually teach us codependency, mutuality, and how we all need each other. And therefore, we can't, look at each other at different levels because we can't do without it. We can't do without each other. So I think that's the only way, equanimity and compassion might sound a little philosophical, but I really don't see any other way that we will be able to go as a society, and which is again inherently there in the fraternity that Ambedkar talks of, because he draws from these concepts of equanimity and compassion. I think if we are able to get there, then I think as a society we'll be able to go forward. I hope that people who are listening to us are not now thinking they have to do charity to the workers, because we very quickly as a society convert any kind of awakening to charity. That's not the intention. The intention, at least where I'm coming from, the intention is for all of us to recognize the work that the workers are doing beyond digging and burning, right? And playing our part in ensuring that they receive what is rightfully theirs as per the Constitution and as humanity demands.
As COVID-19 raged through Bangalore, the city's crematoria and burial grounds were overwhelmed with the dead and their grieving kin. The hard labor of processing corpses as well as collective grief fell on Bangalore's crematorium and cemetery workers. In this episode of BIC Talks, anthropologist Shreyas Sreenath interviews researcher and activist Swathi Seshadri. Swathi recently co-authored a report released by the All India Central Council for Trade Unions, AICCTU, detailing labour conditions at Bangalore's crematoria and cemeteries. This report is available to read in detail on the BIC website. They discuss the significance of funerary work in holding together the fabric of our social, psychic, and spiritual lives, both in times of stability and crisis. They also speak about the various ways in which caste prejudice routinely degrades communities pushed into toiling with our dead. And now, over to Shreyas.
Thank you, Lekha. So we're here to speak about a report that was released by AICCTU on cemetery workers in Bangalore. And this was a very important report that covered around 25 cemeteries and burial grounds, Hindu, Christian, and Muslim. And the field workers and the researchers did this research at the height of the pandemic in mid-May, and which was when the report was released. And so we have one of the authors of the report here with us today, Swathi Seshadri. Swathi, it's a pleasure to have the opportunity to speak to you. And I commend you and your team for conducting such painstaking work on the state of Bangalore's cemetery workers. Can you give us a sense of how many cemeteries you visited, the labor conditions in each locations, and just generally what you learned about with regards to the work of burying and cremating our dead during this pandemic?
Thanks, Shreyas. Thanks, BIC. I also would like to acknowledge that Lekha and Kripa were the other two authors, of this report. So I just want to put it out there. It's the three of us who collectively wrote this report. We visited about 23 to 25 crematoriums and burial grounds, and they could broadly be categorized into three kinds of crematoriums. So one is a crematoriums, which are the electric crematoriums, and they are run by the people. The second kind of crematoriums are the temporary crematoriums. There were about 2 or 3 temporary crematoriums that were set up because of the number of cremations per day. The existing crematoriums couldn't take that load. And so there were temporary ones, and we visited 2 of the 3. The third is the burial grounds, which are administered by private trusts. For example, the Christian and the Muslim burial grounds are administered by private trusts, and it's only the Hindu burial grounds which are under the. So These are the three categories of burial grounds which exist in Bangalore, and work conditions vary depending on what kind of burial ground or crematorium they are. So during the height of the pandemic, one to remember that workers were working till 6 in the morning. Sometimes the electric crematoriums were working till about 9, 10 in the night. And the wood fire and the burial grounds, they were working sometimes even until 1 and 2 in the night because of just the large number of deaths per day. And all the crematoriums were not put to COVID just because there were a bunch that were kept aside for non-COVID deaths. So it's not like all the crematoriums were put to use for COVID. They were getting electric crematoriums were getting anything between 30 to 35, deceased persons per day, and burial grounds, the private burial grounds, were seeing up to 70, 80, 100 a week. So that's the nature of that's the extent of work that the workers were doing. With respect to the electric crematoriums, what the workers told us is that it takes about an hour or 45 minutes to an hour average based on the size of the person who passed away for it to fully burn down. So you can imagine if they were doing 35 per day, how many hours they were working for. Or to dig a grave took 4 hours for one grave. Except the Hindu burial grounds, the BBMP and Hindu burial grounds, they were given JCBs and the government paid for those JCBs. But all the others, the private ones, the Christian and Muslim burial grounds, also because of space, there was no space for the JCBs to go in. In some instances, they were able to use JCBs. In some instances, they were not able to. People were actually manually, physically, digging the graves. So that also meant one is more number of, hours of work, but it also meant more number of people who were needed for work. And so we see that everywhere, it doesn't matter what kind of crematorium or burial ground it is, there was almost 2 to 3 times the number of people who had been hired for this, and they were of course all temporary staff. So that was the state. With respect to the BBMP workers, those who'd been hired temporarily for this, they'd been told they would be paid, but they hadn't been told how much they would be, right? But yet there were people who obviously were going there, and we get to why there were so many people ready to take up this work a little later, but absolutely casual kind of work. In the case of the Christian and the Muslim burial grounds, you usually have a few people, a caretaker who's there in the burial ground, and then there are some people who are hired. And then they took on, per grave, because of the large numbers, they took on more people per grave. They were paid about 2,500. But usually that work was split between 4 people. So it's not like one person got the entire money. So I'm just trying to explain the extent of people that was needed to bury the dead during COVID. And remember, we went only to the COVID linked crematoriums. We didn't go to the non-COVID ones. So that's another, because several of the crematoriums were closed for non-COVID cremations. That again put a stress on the others, for even in the non-COVID crematorium. So all in all, I think it was an extremely stressed system, which has been working the people and the machines. For example, every crematorium would need a 15-day break because either the coils were burnt out or the doors to the crematorium were not working because of the very high use of the machine itself. So I think everything and everyone was under stress. People were under stress, families were under stress, machines were under stress. So that's really the extent of the very deep extent of problems that there were. Now, I think the first question when it comes to workers is the question of wages. But before that, there's a question of identity. Are they even considered workers or not? And often, especially in the burial grounds, they were considered caretakers, and not workers or diggers, but they were caretakers. And we all know caregiving work in the world, across the world, is an unpaid, kind of task. So just the terminology of this person's a caretaker takes away from their worker identity, and therefore automatically keeps them away from a lot of benefits and other things that they would have been entitled to had they not been considered caretakers. So this is I think one fundamental change that the government also and the private trust need to do going forward is to how do they identify the persons. Now, because they were caretakers, for example, in some of the Muslim burial grounds, they were not even paid. They were given housing, but they weren't paid anything, or they were paid some very nominal 1,000 or 2,000 rupees, which we all know is really nothing to live a life today. So it's like you're doing this, free or pro bono, and actually they're actually earning nothing. It's not like they're able to go out and really work anywhere because of the stigma that's attached. Because they live in a burial ground, they don't get work, or even if they do get work, once employers know they live in the burial ground, they lose work. So they're just given homes and they're not given any payment. The understanding is that the families of members who are buried there will give bakshish, but still bakshish is dole and it's not a right. Right. So that is the status, on the one hand, in terms of the private burial grounds. And in terms of the government crematoriums and burial grounds, there is a minimum wage. According to the Minimum Wage Act, there's a 13,132 rupee a minimum wage that has been fixed. But some of the older workers get about 10,000, but none of the newer employees workers are given even 10,000. Interestingly, they're not paid every month. Sometimes they're paid once a year. And that to us, doing the research was extremely shocking. Because I mean, for us, work, you're employed, you get a monthly income. And when they were paid an annual payment, or they were paid once in 8 months or 10 months, an amount would be transferred to their bank. So they didn't know what actually they were paid. They wouldn't know what their salary was. They wouldn't know what deductions are made. There's definitely no ESI. There is definitely no PF. They do not have health cards. So it's completely precarious and casual, even the BBMP one, even the BBMP workers. So when the BBMP workers are so casual, we can imagine what the status with the private trusts are. So there's no ESI, no EPF. Like I said, earlier, obviously all of them are below poverty line, and they technically should have health cards, but none of them had, health cards. The grave diggers, for example, in the Kalpalli Christian cemetery, they were paid 5,500 a month. Right, that's it. Though a minimum wage has been prescribed, and it's incumbent on everyone who employs this kind of worker to pay the minimum wage, whether they are hired by the government or not. But they were getting paid only 5,500, and each person, a family who was burying a dead, was charged 500, but 150 was given to the workers. So clearly, there is some additional cost for administration. That, for example, the church was taking away from this. So you're seeing that it's completely, it's less than minimum wage. Forget, fair wages. During COVID, one would hope, about the sanitizing part of it, where there's either PPE kits, sanitizers, gloves, etc. And what we heard is that, for example, the Christian cemetery, they didn't use any PPE kits. It's also very difficult to dig. That was a cemetery which didn't have space for a JCB to go in. And it's difficult to dig with a PPE kit on. But there was no attempt to offer any other kind of protection either, except putting boric acid powder into the grave. So they were given X amount of kgs of boric acid per grave, and they were just putting it out there. So that's the health-wise precariousness in the burial kind of places. Often, person with COVID-19 was buried just a stone's throw away from the house. That's how close the homes and the graves are in these places. Those who were working in the crematoriums and the electric crematoriums, they were given PPE kits, not consistently, sometimes given, sometimes not. But when they go to collect the ashes, it becomes very difficult to wear it because it's really, really hot. So the ashes are in a chamber below where the fire burns, and people to walk into that chamber and collect the ashes. So in that kind of heat, to wear PPE kits was actually harmful for them. They could get burnt if they wore it, so they weren't. Definitely, those who were doing the wood pile work, those who were placing the body on the pyre could have worn PPE kits, but those who were actually lighting the pyre, there's no way they could use PPE kits. There's one report we saw on Twitter where a worker in one of the wood pyre crematoriums actually showed that his hand was burnt because he'd worn the gloves and the gloves got fire. Right, so that is also the kind of precarious health-wise and conditions that they have worked through the entire COVID, the second phase of COVID. It took the government a very long time to recognize crematorium and burial ground workers as frontline workers. So while the nurses and the doctors were given their vaccines and they were treated, with special care, but neither do you see the mortuary workers or the burial ground workers being recognized as frontline workers. And it actually took a good amount of struggle by the workers and unions for the government to accept frontline workers and that they be given all the rights as frontline workers would get. But having said that, the only benefit that they did get, which I don't think is even a benefit, it was the vaccines. But last year, for example, some of the frontline workers, like the ASHA workers, were given a risk fund, a risk amount for the risks they were undertaking while going and doing the contact tracing and things like that. But that was not mandated or prescribed for the burial ground and crematorium workers. So that's been another challenge. In terms of living conditions, while in the electric crematoriums, you don't find people living in the crematorium itself. What you do see in the burial grounds, especially the older ones, is that you have people living in the burial ground itself. So you have, for example, in Kalpalli, you have about 5 or 7 families, living in the burial ground, or even in the Kalpalli Christian cemetery, you have about 5 families. You have in the Hosur Christian cemetery, you have about 10, 15 families. In all the Muslim burial grounds, there's definitely one family. So, of course, these are really hut, they might be cement, but they're just a small room. They're hutments, they're not really proper homes. Sanitation is missing, electricity is there or not there. Water, the Kalpalli Christian cemetery has to actually get water from the nearby slum for drinking purposes because they don't have water on campus. There is a toilet, there, which has been locked for the past 6 months and not opened for some bureaucratic reasons. So they actually, there is open defecation in the heart of Bangalore because they don't have access to toilets. So living conditions are abysmal. Definitely there is no sanitation, water, electricity. These are all massive challenges. And finally, and actually most importantly to say, is that these workers have been doing generational work, right? We'll go to the point of caste later, but because they're doing generational work, education is not something that's been traditionally paid attention to. However, almost everyone we spoke to now said they do not want their children to, be in this profession, but accessing schools is very difficult. Again, because of the stigma of living inside the burial ground, if, especially for those families who are living inside the burial ground. Those who are still outside are not as stigmatized, but those who are living in the burial ground are facing that stigma as well. And educating the children is also becoming challenge. So this is kind of a broad overview. There is the report, and one can go through the report for more details. But this is what was broadly what we saw as the work and living conditions of workers in the crematoriums and burial grounds.
Thank you, Swathi. That was a very detailed and wonderful summary. And for those of our listeners who'd want to take a look at the report, of course, as Swathi said, there's a lot of information in there that Swathi mentioned that you can see in more detail, but there's also these photographs of locked bathrooms. And there's one really sort of heart-wrenching photograph of a house, a sort of a chamber where a family lives that is right next to a grave, so to speak. And if you can only imagine what it feels like, not only for the workers themselves, but their families, for the children to wake up in the morning to see furnaces that are lit to such a degree that they're melting because there's so many bodies that are being burnt. I think just to give some perspective, I believe the report says in pre-pandemic times, there was somewhere around 0 to 5 funerals that were done in these sites. That increased, as Swathi just mentioned, to 35. So that just gives a sense of the intensity and the increased intensity of this work. So, one impetus for our conversation, as I mentioned and Swathi just described, was of course the report. But another important spark was the moving testimony that Sauri Raj, a cemetery worker and a member of the B.R. Ambedkar Dalit Sangharsh Samiti Graveyard Workers Union, gave on 2 separate occasions. And this is how we actually got to talking about this program. One was a testimony he gave at the release of the report, and another was a sort of almost a plea for people to wear their masks during the Count Every Death program that is run by a range of progressive organizations. So we'll be referring to these testimonies throughout. And so I want to touch upon, we'll listen to a clip that where Sauri Raj is speaking, and we'll just return to briefly touch upon some of his remarks.
ಇವತ್ತಿನ ಕಾರ್ಯಕ್ರಮನ ಮುಂದುವರ್ಸೋಣ. ಮೊದಲಿಗೆ ನಮ್ಮ ಜೊತೆಗೆ ಡಾಕ್ಟರ್ BR ಅಂಬೇಡ್ಕರ್ ದಲಿತ್ ಸಂಘರ್ಷ ಸಮಿತಿ ಗ್ರೇವ್ಯಾರ್ಡ್ ವರ್ಕರ್ಸ್ ಯೂನಿಯನ್ ಸೌರಿ ರಾಜ ಅವರು ನಮ್ ಜೊತೆಗೆ ಇದ್ದಾರೆ. ಅವರು ಒಂದೆರಡು ಮಾತುಗಳನ್ನ ಆಡ್ಬೇಕು ಅಂತ ಹೇಳಿ ಕೇಳ್ಕೊಳ್ತೀನಿ.
ಮೇಡಮ್ ನಮಸ್ಕಾರ. ಬಂದಿರೋರು ಎಲ್ರಿಗೂ ನಮ್ಮ ಸಂಘಟನೆಯಿಂದ ಎಲ್ರಿಗೂ ಒಂದು ಧನ್ಯವಾದ ಹೇಳ್ತಾ ಇದ್ದೀವಿ. ನಾವು ಈ ಕೋವಿಡ್ ಟೈಮ್ಗೆ ಎಷ್ಟು ಕಷ್ಟ ಅಂದ್ರೆ ಅಷ್ಟು ಕಷ್ಟ ಬಿದ್ದು ನಾವು ಎಲ್ಲರೂ ಕೆಲಸ ಮಾಡ್ತಾ ಇದ್ದೀವಿ. ನಾವು ಗೌರ್ಮೆಂಟ್ಗೆ ಒಂದೇ ಒಂದು ಮನವಿ ಇಟ್ಟಿದ್ದೀವಿ, ಏನಂದ್ರೆ ನಮ್ಮನ್ನ ಡಿ ಗ್ರೂಪ್ ನೌಕರಾಗಿ ಪರಿಗಣಿಸ್ಬೇಕು ಅಂತ. ಯಾಕಂದ್ರೆ ನಾವು ಝೀರೋನಲ್ಲಿ ಇದ್ದೀವಿ ಮೇಡಮ್. ಎಲ್ಲ ಟೋಟಲ್ ನಮ್ಮ ರುದ್ರಭೂಮಿನಲ್ಲಿ ವಿದ್ಯುತ್ ಚಿತ್ರಗಾರದಲ್ಲಿ ಕೆಲಸ ಮಾಡೋರು. ನಮ್ಗಂತ ಯಾವ ಫೆಸಿಲಿಟಿನೂ ಇಲ್ಲ. ನಾವು ಒಂದು ಹೆಲ್ತ್ ಕಾರ್ಡ್ ಇಲ್ಲ ನಮ್ಗೆ. ಏನಂದ್ರೆ ಒಂದು ಹಾಸ್ಪಿಟಲ್ ಹೋದ್ರೆ ನಿಮ್ದು ಹೆಲ್ತ್ ಕಾರ್ಡ್ ಇದೆಯಾ ಅಂತ ಕೇಳ್ತಾರೆ. ಇನ್ಶೂರೆನ್ಸ್ ಇಲ್ಲ. ಕೋವಿಡ್ ವೈರಸ್ ಫಸ್ಟ್ ಲೈನ್ ಅಂತ ಹೇಳ್ತಾರೆ. ನಮ್ಗೆ ಆ ಫಸ್ಟ್ ಲೈನ್ ಕೋವಿಡ್ ವೈರಸ್ ಅಂತ ಏನು ನಮ್ಗೆ ಇನ್ನ ಇದು ಮಾಡಿಲ್ಲ. ಬೇರೆ ಇಂಜೆಕ್ಷನ್ ಮಾತ್ರ ಹಾಕಿದ್ರು, ಬೇರೆ ಯಾವ್ದು ಇಲ್ಲ. ಇನ್ನ ನಮ್ಗೆ ಏನಂದ್ರೆ ನೋಡಿ ಮೇಡಮ್, ಇವ್ರದ್ದು ನಾವು ಗುರ್ತೋರ್ಸ್ತಾ ಇದ್ದೀವಿ. ಈ ಕೋವಿಡ್ ಟೈಮ್ಗೆ ನೈಟ್ ಟು ಡೇ ಕಷ್ಟ ಬಿದ್ದು ನಾವು ಎಲ್ರು ಕೆಲಸ ಮಾಡಿ, ಇದು ನಿಮ್ಮವ್ರದ್ದು ಬೂದಿ, ಇದು ನಿಮ್ಮವ್ರದ್ದು ಸಮಾಧಿ ಅಂತ ನಾವು ಗುರ್ತೋರ್ಸ್ತಾ ಇದ್ದೀವಿ ಎಲ್ರಿಗೂ. ಗೌರ್ಮೆಂಟ್ಗೆ ನಾವು ಗುರ್ತಿಲ್ಲ. ಯಾಕಂದ್ರೆ ಲೇಬರ್ ಡಿಪಾರ್ಟ್ಮೆಂಟ್ ನಲ್ಲಿ ಮಶಾನ ಕಾವಲುಗಾರರ ಅಂತ ಇದೆ, ಒಂದು ಆಟೋ ಡ್ರೈವರ್ಗಿದೆ, ಒಂದು ಪೇಂಟ್ರಿಗಿದೆ, ಒಂದು ಬಿಲ್ಡಿಂಗ್ ವರ್ಕರ್ಸ್ಗಿದೆ. ಎಲ್ರೂ ಸೇರಿ ಮಣ್ ಮಾಡೋದು ನಾವು, ಸುಡೋದು ನಾವು. ಟೋಟಲ್ ಲಾಸ್ಟ್ ಡೆಡ್ ಎಂಡು ಆ ಕೆಲಸ ಮಾಡೋರು ನಾವು ಲೆಕ್ಕದಲ್ಲೇ ಇಲ್ಲ. ಹೆಂಗಿದೆ ನೋಡಿ ಮೇಡಮ್. ಏನಂದ್ರೆ ನಾವು ಸುಮಾರು ಒಂದು 2012 ನಾವು ಹೋರಾಟ ಮಾಡ್ಕೊಂಡು ಬರ್ತಾ ಇದ್ದೀವಿ. BBMP ಮುತ್ತಿಗೆ ಹಾಕಿದ್ದೀವಿ. ತಿರ್ಗಾ ನಾವು ಮಶಾನ ಒಲೆಗೆ ಗುಂಡಿ ಹಾಕ್ಬಿಟ್ಟು, ನಾವು ನಮ್ಮ ಲೀಡರ್ ಸುರೇಶ್ ಅಂತ, ಅಂಬೇಡ್ಕರ್ ದಲಿತ ಸಂಘರ್ಷ ಸಮಿತಿ ಸ್ಟೇಟ್ ಸೆಕ್ರೆಟರಿ ಅವರು ನಾವೆಲ್ಲ ಗುಂಡಿ ಒಲೆಗೆ ಮಲ್ಕೊಂಡು ಮಣ್ಣು ಮೇಲೆ ಹಾಕೊಂಡು, ಕಮಿಷನರ್ ಮಂಜುನಾಥ್ ಸಾಹೇಬ್ರು ಇದ್ರು, ಪದ್ಮಾವತಿ ಮೇಯರ್ ಅವರು ಇದ್ರು. ಅವ್ರು ಬಂದು ನಿಮ್ಗೆ ಏನಿದೆ ನಾವು ಮಾಡ್ಕೊಡ್ತೀವಿ ಅಂತ ಹೇಳಿದ್ರು. ಆಯ್ತು, 1 ವರ್ಷ ಹಂಗೆ ಹೋಯ್ತು. ನಮ್ಗೆ ಪೇಮೆಂಟ್ ಟೋಟಲ್ 14,000 ಚಿಲ್ಲರೆ ಬಂತು. PF ES ಎಲ್ಲ ಕಟ್ ಆಗ್ತಾ ಇದೆ. 10,400 ರೂಪಾಯಿ ಸ್ಯಾಲ್ರಿ ಬರ್ತಾ ಇದೆ 148 ಜನಕ್ಕೆ. PF ಇಲ್ಲ, ES ಇಲ್ಲ, ಆ ಕಾರ್ಡ್ ನಂಬರ್ನು ಇಲ್ಲ, ನಮ್ಗೆ ಕೊಟ್ಟೇ ಇಲ್ಲ. ಇನ್ನ ದುಡ್ಡು ಮಾತ್ರ ಕಟ್ ಆಗ್ತಾ ಇದೆ. ಅದು ಕೇಳಿದ್ರೆ ಯಾರು ರೆಸ್ಪಾನ್ಸ್ ಇಲ್ಲ. ಹಿಂಗಿದೆ ನಮ್ದು. ಏನಂದ್ರೆ ಒಂದು ಎಮರ್ಜೆನ್ಸಿ ಹಾಸ್ಪಿಟಲ್ ಈ ಕೋವಿಡ್ ಟೈಮ್ಗೆ ಬೆಡ್ ಸಿಗ್ತಾ ಇಲ್ಲ ಇಲ್ಲಿ. ನೋಡಿ, ನಾವು ಡೇ ನೈಟು ಕೆಲಸ ಮಾಡ್ತಾ ಇದ್ವಿ ಮೇಡಮ್. ನಾವು ಎಷ್ಟೆಷ್ಟು ಬಾಡಿಗಳು ಮಣ್ ಮಾಡ್ತೀವಿ, ಸುಡ್ತೀವಿ. ಈ ಕೋವಿಡ್ಗೆ ಜೊತೆಗೆ ಯಾರು ಬರ್ತಾರೆ ಏನು ಅಂತ ನಮ್ಗೆ ಗೊತ್ತಾಗೋದಿಲ್ಲ. ಇದು ನಾರ್ಮಲ್ ಬಾಡಿ, ಇದು ಕೋವಿಡ್ ಬಾಡಿ ಅಂತ ಸರ್ಟಿಫಿಕೇಟ್ ಕೊಡ್ತಾರೆ. ಜೊತೆಗೆ ಬರೋವರಿಗೆ ಇವ್ರಿಗೆ ಪಾಸಿಟಿವ್ ಇದೆಯಾ ನೆಗೆಟಿವ್ ಇದೆಯಾ ಅಂತ ನಮ್ಗೆ ಗೊತ್ತಾಗ್ತದ? ಅವ್ರ ಜೊತೆಗೇನೋ ನಾವು ಇದ್ದು ಲಾಸ್ಟ್ ಅವ್ರಿಗೆ ಏನ್ ಮಾಡ್ಬೇಕು ಅವ್ರೇ ಯಾರು ಮುಟ್ಟೋದಿಲ್ಲ. ನಾವು ನಮ್ಮ ಅಪ್ಪ, ನಮ್ಮಮ್ಮ, ನಮ್ ಅಣ್ಣ, ನಮ್ ಸ್ವಂತದವರು ಅಂತ ನಾವು ಅದು ಅವ್ರಿಗೆ ಏನ್ ಮಾಡ್ಬೇಕು ಲಾಸ್ಟ್ ಅದು ಮಾಡಿ ನಾವು ಕಲಿಸ್ತಾ ಇದ್ದೀವಿ. ಒಂದೇ ಒಂದು ಹೆಲ್ಪ್ ನಮ್ಗೆ ಗೌರ್ಮೆಂಟ್ ಮಾಡ್ಬೇಕಂದ್ರೆ ನಮ್ನ ಎಲ್ರು ಡಿ ಗ್ರೂಪ್ ನೌಕರಾಗಿ ಪರಿಗಣಿಸ್ಬೇಕು. ನಮ್ಗೇನು ಬೇರೆ ಅವ್ರಿಗೆ ಏನ್ ಕೊಡ್ತಾ ಇದ್ದಾರೆ ಗೌರ್ಮೆಂಟ್, ನಾವು ಹೆಚ್ಚಿ ಏನ್ ಕೇಳ್ತಾ ಇಲ್ಲ. ಗೌರ್ಮೆಂಟ್ಗೆ ನಾವು ಒಂದೇ ಒಂದು ಮನವಿ ಅಂದ್ರೆ, ಬೇರೆ ಅವ್ರಿಗೆ ಏನ್ ಕೊಡ್ತಾ ಇದ್ರ, ನಾವು ಮಿನಿಮಮ್ ಇದ್ರು ನಾವು ಒಂದು 300 ಜನ ಇದೀವಿ ಮೇಡಮ್. ನಮ್ಗೆ ಡಿ ಗ್ರೂಪ್ ಮಾಡಕ್ಕೆ ಏನು ಕಷ್ಟ ಇಲ್ಲ. 300 ಜನ ಇದ್ದಾರೆ. 300 ಜನಕ್ಕೆ ಮಾಡಕ್ಕೆ ಏನು ಇದಿಲ್ಲ, ಮಾಡ್ಬೋದು. ಯಾಕಂದ್ರೆ ನೋಡಿ, ಯಾವ ಲೈನ್ ನಲ್ಲಿ ಇಲ್ಲ ಮೇಡಮ್. ನಾವು ಲಾಸ್ಟ್ ಕೆಲಸ ಈ ಕೋವಿಡ್ ಟೈಮ್ಗೆ ಹೋದ್ ವರ್ಷ ಜನ ಸುಡಕ್ಕೆ ಯಾರು ಮುಂದೆ ಬಂದಿಲ್ಲ. ಎಲ್ಲ ರುದ್ರಭೂಮಿಗೆ ಹೋಗಿ ವಿಕ್ರಮ್ ಹಾಸ್ಪಿಟಲ್ ಫಸ್ಟ್ ಬಾಡಿ ಬೆಂಗಳೂರಿನಲ್ಲಿ ಹೋದ್ ವರ್ಷ ಯಾರು ಲಾಸ್ಟ್ ಕಲ್ಪಲ್ಲಿಗೆ ತಗೊಂಡ್ ಬಂದ್ರು. ಅಲ್ಲಿ ಯಾರು ಮಾಡ್ತಾ ಇಲ್ಲ. ನಾವು ನಮ್ ಬ್ರದರ್ ಅಲ್ಲಿ ಹೋಗಿ ನಿಂತು 2 PP ಕಿಟ್ ಕೊಟ್ರು. 4 ಜನ ಎತ್ಕೊಂಡು ಹೋಗ್ಬೇಕು ಬಾಡಿ, ಇಲ್ಲ 2 PP ಕಿಟ್ ಕೊಡ್ತೀನಿ, 2 PP ಕಿಟ್ ಕೊಟ್ರು. ಇಬ್ರು ಹಾಕೊಂಡಿದ್ರು. ನಾನ್ ಬೇರೆ ಗ್ಲೌಸ್ ಮಾಸ್ಕ್ ಹಾಕೊಂಡು ಬಾಡಿ ಅದು ಬರ್ನ್ ಮಾಡಿದ್ದು. ಆಮೇಲೆ ಅವಾಗನೇ ಕಮಿಷನರ್ಗೆ ಅನಿಲ್ ಕುಮಾರ್ ಸಾಹೇಬ್ರು ಇದ್ರು, ಮೆಸೇಜ್ ಮಾಡ್ದೆ ಸರ್ ಈ ತರ ಅಂತ. ಮಾರನೇ ದಿನ ಕರೆದು 60 PP ಕಿಟ್ ತಗೊಂಡು ಎಲ್ಲಿ ಎಲೆಕ್ಟ್ರಿಕ್ 12 ಎಲೆಕ್ಟ್ರಿಕ್ ಕ್ರೆಮಟೋರಿಯಂ ನಲ್ಲಿ 10 ಎಲೆಕ್ಟ್ರಿಕ್ ಕ್ರೆಮಟೋರಿಯಂಗೆ ನಾನು 4 PP ಕಿಟ್ ಕೊಟ್ಟೆ. ಸೇಫ್ಟಿ ಇಟ್ಕೊಳ್ಳಿ, ಬಾಡಿ ಯಾವಾಗ ಏನು ಅಂತ ಗೊತ್ತಾಗೋದಿಲ್ಲ. ನಮ್ ಸೇಫ್ಟಿ ಫಸ್ಟ್. ನಮ್ ಜನ ನಮ್ನ ನಂಬ್ಕೊಂಡಿದ್ದಾರೆ ಮೇಡಮ್. ನಾವು ನಮ್ ಜನ ಸೇಫ್ಟಿ ನಾವು ನೋಡ್ಬೇಕು. ಯಾಕಂದ್ರೆ ಇವಾಗ ನನ್ನ ನಂಬ್ಕೊಂಡು ನಮ್ ಫ್ಯಾಮಿಲಿ ಇದ್ದೆ. ನನ್ಗೇನಂದ್ರೆ ನನ್ಗೆ 6 ಮಕ್ಳು, 4 ಹೆಣ್ಮಕ್ಳು, 2 ಗಂಡ್ ಮಗು ಇದ್ದಾರೆ. ನಮ್ ಮಿಸ್ಸಸ್ ಇದಾರೆ, ನಮ್ ತಾಯಿ ಇದಾರೆ ವಯಸ್ಸಾಗಿರೋರು. ನಮ್ನ ನಂಬ್ಕೊಂಡು ನಮ್ ಫ್ಯಾಮಿಲಿ ಇದೆ. ನಾವು ಹೆಲ್ಪ್ ಮಾಡ್ತೀವಿ. ನಾವು ಝೀರೋನಲ್ಲಿ ಇದ್ದೀವಿ. ನಮ್ಗೆ ಏನಂದ್ರೆ ಇದ್ರೆ ಯಾರು ಇಲ್ಲ ಮೇಡಮ್, ಬರೋದಿಲ್ಲ. ಎಷ್ಟು ಬಾಡಿಗಳು ನಾವು ಮಾಡಿದೀವಿ ಅಂದ್ರೆ ಸುಮಾರು ಇವಾಗ ಹೋದ್ ತಿಂಗಳು 22ನೇ ಕಲ್ಪಲ್ಲಿಗೆ ಮಣ್ಣು ಮಾಡಕ್ ಆರ್ಡರ್ ಆಯ್ತು. 22ರಿಂದ ಇವತ್ತು ಒಂದ್ ವಾರ ಆಯ್ತು ಸ್ಟಾಪ್ ಆಗಿ, ಜಾಗ ಇಲ್ಲ ಅಂತ. ಸುಮಾರು 240 250 ಬಾಡಿ ಸುಮಾರು ಮಣ್ಣು ಮಾಡಿದ್ದೀವಿ. ಇಷ್ಟು ಬಾಡಿ ಮಾಡಿದ್ದೀವಿ ನೋಡಿ. JCP ಫ್ರೀ ಕಮಿಷನರ್ಗೆ ಹೇಳ್ದೆ ಸರ್ ಈ ತರ ಬೇಕು ಅಂತ. ಅವರು ರಂದೀಪ್ ಸಾರು ಸರ್ಫರಾಜ್ ಖಾನ್ ಸರ್ಗೆ ಇದ್ರೆ ಮಾತಾಡಿ ಅವ್ರಿಗೆ ಇನ್ಚಾರ್ಜ್ ಕೊಟ್ಟಿದ್ದೀನಿ ಅಂತ ಗೌರವ್ ಗುಪ್ತಾ ಸಾಹೇಬ್ರು ಹೇಳಿದ್ರು. ಸರ್ಫರಾಜ್ ಖಾನ್ ಸರ್ಗೆ ಹೇಳ್ದೆ ಮಾತಾಡ್ದೆ, JCP ಅರೇಂಜ್ ಮಾಡಿ ಕೊಟ್ರು ಪಬ್ಲಿಕ್ಗೆ. ಬೇರೆ ಪ್ರೈವೇಟ್ ಗಾಡಿ ಇಟ್ಕೊಂಡು ಮಾಡಿದ್ರು, ಅವರು ದುಡ್ಡು ಜಾಸ್ತಿ ಕೇಳ್ತಾ ಇದ್ರು. ಬರೋರಿಗೆ ನಾವು ಸೇಫ್ಟಿ ಮಾಡ್ತಾ ಇದೀವಿ ಮೇಡಮ್. ನಾವು ಯಾಕಂದ್ರೆ ಈ ಲಾಕ್ ಟೈಮ್ಗೆ ಎಷ್ಟು ಕಷ್ಟ ಇರ್ತದೆ, ಎಷ್ಟು ನೋವಿನಲ್ಲಿ ಬರ್ತಾರೆ. ಲಾಸ್ಟ್ ಕೊನೆ ಜಾಗಕ್ಕೆ ನಮ್ಮ ಹತ್ರ ಬರ್ತಾರೆ. ನಾವಾಗಿ ನೀಟಾಗಿ ಅವ್ರು ಸಮಾಧಾನ ಮಾಡಿ ಕಳ್ಸ್ಬೇಕು. ಅವರು ಎಲ್ರೂ ಕಲ್ಕೊಂಡಿದ್ದಾರೆ, ಹಾಸ್ಪಿಟಲ್ ದುಡ್ಡು ಎಲ್ಲ ಹೋಗಿ ಲಾಸ್ಟ್ಗೆ ಬರ್ತಾರೆ. ನಮ್ ಕೈನಲ್ಲಿ ಆಗಿರೋದು ನಾಳೆ ನಮ್ಗೆ ಅದು. ನಮ್ಮ ಮನೆಯಲ್ಲಿ ಆಗಿದ್ರೆ ನಾವ್ ಹೆಂಗ್ ಮಾಡ್ತೀವಿ, ಹಂಗ್ ಮಾಡಿ ಒಬ್ಬೊಬ್ಬರಿಗೆ ನಾವು ಕಳಿಸ್ತಾ ಇದೀವಿ. ನಮ್ಗೇನಂದ್ರೆ ನೋಡಿ, ಬೂದಿ ಕೇಳ್ತಾರೆ, ಸ್ಲಿಪ್ ತಗೊಂಡ್ ಬರ್ತಾರೆ. ಇವ್ರದ್ದು ಬೂದಿ ಅಂತ ನಾವು ಆ ಮಟ್ಕೆನಲ್ಲಿ ಎತ್ತಿಕ್ತೀವಿ. ಇದು ನಿಮ್ ತಂದೆದು ಬೂದಿ, ಇದು ನಿಮ್ ತಾಯಿದು ಬೂದಿ, ಇದು ನಿಮ್ಮವ್ರದ್ದು ಬೂದಿ ಅಂತ ಕೊಡ್ತೀವಿ. ಇವಾಗ 250 ಬಾಡಿಗಳಿದೆ ಇಲ್ಲಿ. ಯಾರ್ದು ಬಾಡಿ ಯಾರ್ದಂತ ಗೊತ್ತಾಗೋದಿಲ್ಲ ಅವ್ರಿಗೆ. ಮಳೆ ಬಂದು ಎಲ್ಲ ಮಠ ಆಗ್ಬಿಡ್ತದೆ. ಇದು ನಿಮ್ದೆ ಅಂತ ID ತೋರಿಸ್ತೀವಿ. ನಮ್ನ ID ತೋರ್ಸಕ್ ಯಾರು ಇಲ್ಲ. ನಾವು ಈ ದೇಶದಲ್ಲಿ ಇದ್ದೀವಿ, ನಮ್ನ ID ತೋರ್ಸಕ್ಕೆ ID ಯಾವ್ದಿಲ್ಲ ಮೇಡಮ್. ಗೌರ್ಮೆಂಟ್ ನಲ್ಲಿ ನೋಡಿ ಎಲ್ರಿಗೂ ಒಂದು ಇದ್ದಾರೆ ಏನೋ ಮಾಡಕ್ಕೆ, ಲೇಬರ್ ಡಿಪಾರ್ಟ್ಮೆಂಟ್ಗೆ. ಅದ್ರಲ್ಲಿ ನಾವು ಲೆಕ್ಕದಲ್ಲೇ ಇಲ್ಲ. ನಾವು ಏನ್ ಮಾಡೋದು ಯೋಚನೆ ಮಾಡಿ. ನಾವು ಇಲ್ಲೇ ತಾನೇ ಇರೋದು. ಇವಾಗ ಗೌರ್ಮೆಂಟ್ ಜೊತೆಗೆ ಸೇರಿ ನಾವು ಕೈ ಜೋಡಿಸಿ ನಮ್ ಕೈನಲ್ಲಿ ಆಗಿರೋದು ನಮ್ ದೇಶಕ್ಕೆ ಮಾಡ್ಬೇಕು. ಇನ್ನೊಂದೇನಂದ್ರೆ ಹೋದ್ ವರ್ಷ ಕೋವಿಡ್ ಟೈಮ್ಗೆ 148 ಜನದು ಸುಮಾರು ಒಂದು ದಿನ ವೇತನ ಇಲ್ಲ ಮೇಡಮ್, ಒಂದು ತಿಂಗಳ ವೇತನ 14,000 ಚಿಲ್ಡ್ರೆ ಟೋಟಲ್ ಒಬ್ಬೊಬ್ಬರದು 148 ಜನದು ಸ್ಯಾಲ್ರಿ ನಾವು ಗೌರ್ಮೆಂಟ್ಗೆ ಸರ್ಕಾರಕ್ಕೆ ಕೊಟ್ಟಿದ್ದೀವಿ. ಸುಮಾರು 22 ಲಕ್ಷಕ್ಕೆ ಮೇಲೆ ಗೌರ್ಮೆಂಟ್ಗೆ ನಾವು ನಮ್ ನೌಕರದು ಎಲ್ಲ ಸ್ಯಾಲ್ರಿ ನಾವು ಗೌರ್ಮೆಂಟ್ಗೆ ಕೊಟ್ಟಿದ್ದೀವಿ ಕೋವಿಡ್ ನಿವಾರಣೆಕ್ಕಂತ. ನಾವು ನಮ್ ಸ್ಯಾಲ್ರಿನೂ ನಾವು ತಿನ್ನಕ್ಕೆ ಕಷ್ಟ ಇದ್ರೂ ನಾವು ಸ್ಯಾಲ್ರಿ ನಾವು ಏನಂದ್ರೆ ಒಂದ್ ಮಾಡ್ಬೇಕು ಅಂತ ನಾವು ಇಷ್ಟು ಮಾಡಿದೀವಿ ಮೇಡಮ್. ಗೌರ್ಮೆಂಟ್ಗೆ ನಾವು ಲೆಕ್ಕದಲ್ಲೇ ಇಲ್ಲ. ಫಸ್ಟ್ ಲೈನ್ ವ್ಯಾರಿಯನ್ಸ್ ಅಂತ ಹೇಳ್ತಾರೆ, ವ್ಯಾಕ್ಸಿನೇಷನ್ ಮಾತ್ರ ಹಾಕ್ತಾರೆ ಮೇಡಮ್. ಯಾವ್ದು ಇದೆ ನಮ್ಗೆ? ಒಂದು ಹೆಲ್ತ್ ಕಾರ್ಡ್ ಇಲ್ಲ, ಒಂದು ಇನ್ಶೂರೆನ್ಸ್ ಇಲ್ಲ. ಏನಂದ್ರೆ ಒಂದು ಹೋದ್ರೆ ಯಾರು ಇಲ್ಲ. ನಮ್ಗೆ ಎಷ್ಟು ಕಷ್ಟ ಇದೆ, ಎಷ್ಟು ನೋವಿದೆ ಗೊತ್ತಾ? ಅದನ್ನು ಎಲ್ಲ ಸಹಿಸ್ಕೊಂಡು ನಾವು ನಮ್ ಜನಕ್ಕೋಸ್ಕರ ನಾವು ಇಷ್ಟು ಮಾಡ್ತಾ ಇದೀವಿ ಮೇಡಮ್.
We just heard the testimony by Sauri Raj, and one thing that really struck, I believe, the both of us was this idea that Sauri Raj keeps speaking about, that there's so much care that these workers take to sort of calm people, to offer them not only sort of the services of burying or cremating a body, but also in the last moments, psychic support in many ways. And forms of therapy, you could really say. And Swathi, you spoke about this work being care work. Sariraj says, samadhana martivi. Sumne body bury madalla, sudalla, samadhana mad kalistivi. We take care of them, we give them some last words. And he also says, we are the last ones to touch your kin, your family members, your fathers, your mothers, your brothers, sisters, when you yourself are not willing to touch them because they might have this disease. But we don't have any mark on society. There is no way, there is no avenue through which we can be identified by society. And I was wondering, Swathi, if you could speak a little bit about how you understand Sauri Raj's testimony vis-a-vis your research, how you understand it for yourself, having been at these sites.
So I think there are several layers, to this, and I think it's time we start from the caste question. Why is it ಅವ್ರಿಗೆ ಗುರ್ತಿಲ್ಲ? Why is it that they're not identified? And that's fundamentally because of the nature of this occupation. It's a traditional occupation. It's a caste occupation. Just like, Paura Karmikas, sanitation workers, manual scavenging, crematorium workers, these are all caste occupations and meant to be invisible, meant to be unidentified. So I think it starts from there. What we've already said is that, for example, Sauri Raj is the 6th generation or 5th generation. His son is the 6th generation graveyard worker, right? And everyone we met, except maybe one or two, they're all doing this from generation after generation. It could be they've been doing it in their village earlier, and now they're doing it in an electric crematorium. But even the people in the electric crematorium are, from the same communities, who've been doing this generationally. So this is, as a community, they're invisible, and it's structured to be so, right? The caste system structures it that they'd be invisible. So that's absolutely point number one. And it's to the discredit then of the government that despite them being government workers, despite them being in government administered crematoriums, the government has really done nothing to take that identity of Dalit away, from the workers. So that's, I think, point number one to be noted. Secondly, is that, for example, I mean, if I were to look at it, from a system psychoanalysis point of view, right, or a psychoanalysis point of view, which is also a part of my training and work, is that as a society, we tend to project or split whatever is, undignified, not very nice, unpleasant things, and to project it onto people and communities. And I think that's what we've done as a society historically, is that we've projected, split away, undignified work, and projected it onto a community, and put a name for Dalit, and cast them out, in that sense. So this is a long process of a societal projection, right? It's not an individual projection, it's an entire society which is projected its unwanted onto a community. So therefore, I'm saying, it's, if we look at it from a sociological point of view, look at it from a psychoanalytic point of view, what we're seeing is that what is not wanted, what is dirty, is sent off, and put on, ascribed, onto a group, and the rest of the people continue living lives, the way they live. And so to break this will be extremely difficult and absolutely necessary, right? Otherwise, we are only perpetuating discrimination that has several angles, to it. So that's one reason why I see Auge Gurtela. And everything else emanates from that. For example, Chauri Raja at one point also goes on to say that he does not have a ration card, because the government department responsible for issuing the ration card does not recognize an address inside a graveyard, right? Now, and what he says is such power and strength and inspiration, where he says a lot of people inside the graveyard, who are living inside the graveyard, have given wrong addresses, I mean different addresses, and got their ration cards because they need that ration. But he and his family has not done that. They've said, if you're giving us our ration card, give it to us with the address, that we live in. These are also government quarters, right? In Kalpalli, these are government built, houses, and he's been determined, and he's rejected having a ration card unless he gets it as that identity of a graveyard worker living in a graveyard. So that is the kind of invisibility. It's not just in their work, but it's in their daily lives that they have to face this non-visible part of it, even in their day-to-day lives. For example, a woman from the graveyard tries to get work as domestic worker outside. She's able to work a month or two. The minute they know that she is living in the graveyard, she's sent back home, right? So this thing of wanting, I mean, to me, it felt like a visual of people pushing, society pushing them into the graveyard, and expecting that they only stay there and never come out. And then what he says, and not in this interview, but actually in another one, where Saudi Raja says that, at the end of the day, everyone comes to the graveyard or the crematorium, and we all go there, right? We all land up there at some point of time, because we all die and we all go there. But when they're living, the people who are living over there are not given the dignity that the dead who go there get, right? So I think that we have to look at it within the caste context, and understand it as a social and a psychological process. It's not merely a social and political process, it's also a psychological process, which we need to understand. All of us have to take back our projections, therefore. I'm part of that collective projection. You are part of that collective projection. And we all have to take back our projections that we have put on to this community for the work, that we don't want to do, and we expect somebody, else to do. So I think that is one way that we look at this, Gurte illa, or I don't have an identity, comes from this social, political, psychological need to put away what is not nice, and hide it away from, society itself.
Thanks, Swati. That's really helpful. And how I understood some of what you were saying in a very concrete way in the testimony was there is a part where Sauriraj says, well, first there's a part where, in your release video, there's a conversation about how, for instance, bank managers laugh at some of the workers when they say, this is our address, and the address is in the burial grounds or the crematoriums. And that is a kind of, it's in many ways, on the one hand, we do not wish to see, but even when we are forced to see, we have this almost immature, sort of childish reaction. And you're really, I think, correct in pointing out this sort of psychic dimensions to this. Is we're almost, we think we're infantilizing or invisibilizing the workers, but in fact, we are the ones that appear increasingly as immature and not fully cognizant of the realities we live in, right? And another sort of instance where what you said really sort of concretely was laid out by Sauriraj is, he says there's a brief point where he says, when your family members turn into corpses, he says they're turned into ash, or when it's monsoon season, for example, like, there were some rains in May, the bodies swell up beyond your own recognition. So this person that you loved your entire life, or that you knew your entire life, is cannot be recognized to you. And we're the ones that are doing the labor of recognizing who that person is. If they, either when they're turned into ash, or when their corpse is sort of deteriorated beyond recognition, we're handing you that identification, and we don't have that same identification, that same gurtu, right? It's kind of a very profound point that he's making, I think. And so sort of going off of that, Swati, you make a very interesting point in the report, which, those of us who read it may miss, but I just want to point it out. You say you and the other authors criticize actually the framing of cemetery work and burial work as a traditional occupation. You think that is a limited understanding. And you also imply that it has casteist connotations. This is an extremely important point, and I was just wondering if you could elaborate more, because you mentioned that the sort of profound nature of the way that our society is broken by caste, and we almost need a new language to talk about this. So I was wondering, what are the limitations to viewing this work as a traditional occupation, and what's a better way to speak about it and a better way to engage with it?
Looking at it as traditional work means you leave it untouched, right? I mean, typically one understands this is our tradition, this is how we do it. So it's not to be questioned. But there are two things here. We forget that tradition is also is a dynamic concept. Traditions change with different eras, right? So to also recognize and remember that traditions are not stuck in time. They are dynamic, they change, they move. But then why is it that some traditions are allowed to be dynamic, but some aren't? Again, it's this whole caste, question that you are this caste, so you will continue doing it. Whatever else might modernize, whatever else might change. At best, we could give you a JCB, but you have to do it with the JCB, right? So one is remembering that tradition itself is not static. The tradition itself is dynamic, and we can't say this is how we do it, because this is not how we did something about 100 years ago, right? I don't think I would be sitting over here 150 years ago and speaking, because technically I should have been running a home and a family, and not having anything to do outside of that 150 years ago. But today we are here, the women are here. So one is tradition is dynamic and it can change. Is that there's nothing blasphemic, for tradition to change. Secondly, is that this, again, I go back to this thing of caregiving and work. The worker identity is the one identity which will help graveyard and crematorium workers break away from a caste identity. Like, it's very, very slowly but surely happening with the Paurakarmikas, for example, in Bangalore. So that is a long and a slow process, as we've seen, with the Paurakarmikas, where there's a lot of conversations between, residents of layouts and the worker. And it will need this understanding of each other and acceptance of each other to to bring about this change. But it's very important that we, the middle class and everyone else, the upper class, see them as workers who are doing a job, a task, and there is interdependency and there's mutuality. There is a need for each other, right? If we don't see that need for each other, where I need you to bury me or burn me when I die, yeah, right? Unless I understand and see that codependency, that will not, break. It's again, I mean, I go back to the projection part of it, is when I have projected the work of cremating and burying the dead as if it's not something that I am concerned about, like as if it's somebody else's, concern. But when my family members or friends die, then I have to go there. So that, I think, is extremely important, the worker identity being established. And I think the union, the graveyard workers union, is starting to do that, has started to do that, where they're struggling for their wages, and they're struggling for ESI and EPF and things like that. And I think that will help us, go. I think a constitutional framework will be the way we will be able to challenge the traditional occupation framework. I don't think there is any other way. And of course, this whole admission that we're all part of this process, right? We are part of the invisibilizing of the graveyard worker, and taking that much small percentage responsibility that you and me have, and acting on that. I think that is an extremely important, way, I think, for all of us to look at it.
Thanks, Swathi. So what really resonated with me in what you just said was it's almost this idea that viewing this kind of labor, that is the work of burying and cremating our dead, as tradition, almost naturalizes the labor onto the body of certain people, when in fact they're laboring, they're working, they're using their bodily capacity, they're using their intellectual capacities. And perhaps we'll end when we end the conversation, we might also think about how they're using even their spiritual capacities to mend things in our broken society on an everyday basis, without which that we couldn't go on. So it's a laboring rather than something that people are naturally born to do. And it's the right thing, and it's the just thing to recognize that labor in full force within a constitutional framework rather than within a casteist framework. So perhaps we could return to some of Sauriraja's testimony and hear some of these themes come out in his own statements.
ಬಂದಿರೋ ಎಲ್ರಿಗೂ ನಮ್ಮ ಸಂಘಟನೆಯಿಂದ ನಮಸ್ಕಾರ ಹೇಳ್ತಾ ಇದ್ದೀವಿ. ಆಮೇಲೆ ಇನ್ನೊಂದು ವಿಷಯ ಏನಂದ್ರೆ, ಈ ನೋವಿನಲ್ಲಿ ತೀರೋಗಿರೋ ಎಲ್ಲಾ ಫ್ಯಾಮಿಲಿಗೂ ನಮ್ಮಿಂದ ಅವ್ರಿಗೂ ಫ್ಯಾಮಿಲಿಗಳಿಗೆ ಕಳ್ಕೊಂಡಿರೋರಿಗೆ ದೇವ್ರು ಧೈರ್ಯ ಕೊಡ್ಬೇಕು. ಕೆಲವರು ತಂದೆನ ಕಳ್ಕೊಂಡಿದ್ದಾರೆ, ತಾಯಿನ ಕಳ್ಕೊಂಡಿದ್ದಾರೆ, ಮನೆಯಲ್ಲಿ ಇರೋರು ಎಲ್ರು ಒಬ್ಬೊಬ್ರು ಕಳ್ಕೊಂಡಿದ್ದಾರೆ. ಅವ್ರಿಗೆಲ್ಲ ದೇವ್ರು ಧೈರ್ಯ ಕೊಡ್ಬೇಕು, ಅವ್ರಿಗೆ ಸಮಾಧಾನ ಸಿಕ್ಬೇಕು ಅಂತ ಈ ಟೈಮ್ಗೆ ನಾವು ಬೇಡ್ತಾ ಇದೀವಿ ಮೇಡಮ್. ಯಾಕೆಂದ್ರೆ ಆ ನೋವು ತುಂಬಾ ನೋವು, ನಮ್ ದುಶ್ಮನ್ ಕೂಡ ಆ ರೀತಿ ಬರ್ಬಾರ್ದು. ಏನಂದ್ರೆ ಆ ನೋವು ಬರ್ತಾರೆ ಇಲ್ವಾ, ಸಾವು ತಗೊಂಡು ತಗೊಂಡು ಅದು ಏನಂತೂ ನಾವು ಹೇಳೋದಿಲ್ಲ. ಯಾಕಂದ್ರೆ ನಮ್ ರಿಲೇಟಿವ್ ಬರೋವ್ರು ಒಬ್ಬೊಬ್ರು ಗೋಲಿದೆ ನೋಡಿ, ನಮ್ ಕಣ್ಣಲ್ಲಿ ನೀರ್ ಬರ್ತಾ ಇತ್ತು. ಹಂಗೆ ನಿನ್ನೆ ಚೆನ್ನಾಗಿದ್ರು, ಇವತ್ ಚೆನ್ನಾಗಿಲ್ಲ. ಮೊನ್ನೆ ಹೋದ್ರು, ಫಂಕ್ಷನ್ ಹೋದ್ರು, ಇಲ್ಲ ಇವತ್ತಿಲ್ಲ. ಅವ್ರು ಹೇಳೋದು ನಮ್ಗೆ ಒಂಥರ ಅದು ನೋವು ಹೇಳಕ್ಕೆ ಆಗೋದಿಲ್ಲ ನಮ್ಗೆ. ಯಾಕಂದ್ರೆ ಅವ್ರು ಹೆಂಗೆ ಇದ್ರು ಎಲ್ರು ಈ ಟೈಮ್ಗೆ ಇಲ್ಲ. ಅವ್ರಿಗೆ ದೇವ್ರೆಲ್ಲ ಸಮಾಧಾನ ಕೊಡ್ಬೇಕು, ಮನೆಯವ್ರಿಗೆ ಧೈರ್ಯ ಕೊಡ್ಬೇಕು. ನಿಜವಾಗಿ ಆ ಫ್ಯಾಮಿಲಿನ ಕಳ್ಕೊಂಡಿರೋರ್ಗೆ ನಮ್ಮಿಂದ ಆಗಿರೋ ಒಂದು ಹೆಲ್ಪ್ ನಮ್ ಕೈಯಿಂದ ಆಗ್ಬೇಕು, ಮಾಡ್ಬೇಕು ಅಂತ ನಮ್ಗೆ ಒಂದು ಇದೆ. ನಮ್ಮ ಮಟ್ಟಕ್ಕೆ ಎಷ್ಟಾಗ್ತದೆ ಅದೇ ಮಾಡಕ್ಕೆ. ಈ ನೋವು ಬಂದು ಬೇರೆ ಯಾರಿಗೂ ಬರಬಾರ್ದು ಮೇಡಮ್. ಫರ್ದರ್ ನೆಕ್ಸ್ಟ್ ಏನಂದ್ರೆ ಇದ್ರೆ ಎಲ್ರಿಗೂ ಒಂದು ಬರೋರು ಹೇಳೋದು, ನಾವು ಬೆಳಗ್ಗೆ 6 ಗಂಟೆಗೆ ಎದ್ದಿದ್ರೆ ಇಡೀ ನೈಟು ಎಷ್ಟ್ ಗಂಟೆಗೆ ಅಂತಾನೆ ಗೊತ್ತಾಗೋದಿಲ್ಲ, ಹಂಗೆ ಕೆಲ್ಸ ಮಾಡ್ತಾ ಇದ್ದಿದ್ದು. ಬರೋರು ಹೇಳೋದು ನಮ್ಗೆ, ಎಲ್ಲಿ ಈ ಹಾಸ್ಪಿಟಲ್ಗೆ ಹೋಗಿದೀವಿ ಬೆಡ್ ಇಲ್ಲ, ಈ ಹಾಸ್ಪಿಟಲ್ಗೆ ಹೋಗಿದೀವಿ ಗಾಡಿ ಸಿಕ್ಲಿಲ್ಲ, ಅದು ಆ ನೋವು ತುಂಬಾ ನೋವು. ಅದು ಅವ್ರು ಹೇಳೋದಲ್ಲ, ಈ ತರ ಯಾರಿಗೂ ಆಗ್ಬಾರ್ದು ಅಂತ ನಾವು ಇದು ಮಾಡ್ತಾ ಇದೀವಿ ಮೇಡಮ್. ತೀರ್ಕೊಂಡಿರೋರ್ಗೆ ಧೈರ್ಯ ಬರ್ಬೇಕು. ಯಾಕಂದ್ರೆ ಇನ್ನೊಂದು ನಾವುನು ಕೇರ್ಫುಲ್ ಆಗಿರ್ಬೇಕು. ಒಂದ್ ಟೈಮ್ ನಮ್ಗೆ ಏಟ್ ಬಿಟ್ರೆ ತಿರ್ಗಾ ಅಲ್ಲಿ ಆ ಜಾಗಕ್ಕೆ ಹೋಗಕ್ಕೆ ನಮ್ಗೆ ಒಂದು ಇದು ಬರ್ತದೆ, ಇಲ್ಲಿ ಡೇಂಜರ್ ಇದೆ ಅಂತ. ಇನ್ನೊಂದ್ ಏನಂದ್ರೆ, ಒಂದು ರೆಡ್ ಲೈಟ್ ಹಾಕಿದ್ರೆ ನಾವು ನಿಂತು ಹೋಗ್ಬೇಕು. ಆ ತರ ಈ ಮಾಸ್ಕ್ ಡಿಸ್ಟೆನ್ಸ್ ತುಂಬಾ ಇಂಪಾರ್ಟೆಂಟ್. ಯಾಕಂದ್ರೆ ಒಂದು ನೋವು ನಮ್ ಮನೆಗೆ ಸಾಕು, ಇನ್ನೊಂದು ಬರಬಾರ್ದು. ಅದ್ರಿಂದ ಎಲ್ರಿಗೂ ತುಂಬಾ ಕೇರ್ಫುಲ್ ಆಗಿ ಇರ್ಬೇಕಂತ ನಮ್ಮಿಂದ ಒಂದು ಚಿಕ್ಕ ರಿಕ್ವೆಸ್ಟ್ ಮೇಡಮ್. ಯಾಕಂದ್ರೆ ಆ ನೋವು ತಿರ್ಗಾ ಯಾರಿಗೂ ಬರಬಾರ್ದು, ನಮ್ ದುಶ್ಮನ್ಗೂ ಈ ರೀತಿ ಬರಬಾರ್ದು. ಅದರಿಂದ ಕೇರ್ಫುಲ್ ಆಗಿ ಎಲ್ಲ ಆಚೆ ಹೋದ್ರು ಮಾಸ್ಕ್ ಹಾಕೋಬೇಕು, ಸ್ವಲ್ಪ ದೂರ ಮೈಂಟೆನೆನ್ಸ್ ಮಾಡ್ಬೇಕು. ಯಾಕಂದ್ರೆ ಇಲ್ಲಿ ಬರೋರು ಸಾವುಗೆ ನಾವ್ ಹೇಳಿದ್ರೆ ಕೇಳೋದೇ ಇಲ್ಲ. ಸರ್ ಮಾಸ್ಕ್ ಹಾಕಿ ಅಂದ್ರು, ನೀವು ನಿಮ್ ಕೆಲ್ಸ ನೋಡಪ್ಪ ಅಂತಾರೆ ಕೆಲವರು ಹಾಕೊಳ್ತಾರೆ. ಹಂಗೆ ಲಾಸ್ಟ್ ಟೈಮ್ ಒಬ್ರು ಒಂದು ಸಾವು ಕೋವಿಡ್ ಬಾಡಿಗೆ ಬಂದಿದ್ರು. ನಾನು ಅವ್ರಿಗೆ ಹೇಳ್ತಾ ಇದ್ದೆ, ಸರ್ ಮಾಸ್ಕ್ ಹಾಕಿ ಅಂತ. 1 ವಾರ ಬಿಟ್ಟು ಪಾಪ ಅವ್ರು ತೀರೋಗ್ಬಿಟ್ಟಿದ್ದಾರೆ. ಅವ್ರ ಮನೆಯಿಂದ ಫೋನ್ ಮಾಡ್ತಾರೆ, ಸರ್ ನೀವ್ ಎಷ್ಟು ಬೈದ್ರು ಅವ್ರಿಗೆ, ಇವಾಗ ಇಲ್ಲ ಸರ್ ಅವರು ತೀರೋಗಿದ್ದಾರೆ ಅಂತ. ಆ ನೋವಿದೆ ನೋಡಿ. ಯಾಕಂದ್ರೆ ನಾವು ಹೇಳ್ತೀವಿ, ನಾವು ಮಶಾನದಲ್ಲಿ ಇದ್ದೀವಿ, ದಿನಾ ನೋಡ್ತೀವಿ ಬಾಡಿಗಳು, ಎಷ್ಟು ಬಾಡಿಗಳು ಬರ್ತದೆ ಅವ್ರದ್ದು. ಈಗ ಬರೋರು ಹೇಳ್ತಾರೆ ಹಿಂಗಿದ್ರು ಹಿಂಗಾಯ್ತು ಅಂತ. ನಾವು ಇನ್ನೊಬ್ರಿಗೆ ಹೇಳ್ತೀವಿ, ಸರ್ ಹಿಂಗಿರ್ಬೇಡ ಅಂತ. ಅದು ಇವ್ರು ಮಶಾನದಲ್ಲಿ ಇರೋರು, ಇವ್ರು ಹೇಳಿದ್ರೆ ನಾವ್ ಏನ್ ಕೇಳ್ಬೇಕು ಅಂತ ಒಂದು ಕೆಲವ್ರು ಮನೆ ಭಾವನೆ ಇಟ್ಕೊಂಡಿರ್ತಾರೆ. ಯಾಕಂದ್ರೆ ನಾವು ಏನ್ ಕೇಳ್ತೀವಿ ಅಂದ್ರೆ, ಆ ನೋವು ಇನ್ನೊಂದ್ಸಲಿ ನಮ್ಗೆ ಬೇಡ ಅನ್ನೋದಕ್ಕೋಸ್ಕರನೇ ನಾವು ಅದು ಹೇಳ್ತಾ ಇರೋದು ಮೇಡಮ್.
Swathi, one thing that really struck me about that testimony is that it's easy to mistake it as Sauraj saying that I have empathy for all of you. You should take care of yourself. I feel for you. But that's not actually what he's doing. If you listen carefully, he's in a very detailed way listing all of the ways in which he labors to take care of people that come in and day out, weeping, wailing, the ends of their wits, so to speak, when he says, there's no, they come and tell me that there's no hospital beds that they found. They couldn't find an ambulance, gaadi siglilla namge, bed siglilla. And then he has to listen to this day in and day out. He says, I wake up at 6 o'clock in the morning and I don't even know how late into the night I work. But these are the sort of, this is the pain that I see on a daily basis. And I don't wish this pain upon the worst of my enemies. So take care of yourself. I don't want you to go through this pain. And the implication is that I'm also I'm laboring with this pain for you. So make my job a little bit easier by taking care of yourself and taking care of each other. And I was just wondering, there's so many layers to what he's saying here, and just wondering what your thoughts were, and if any aspects of your research really sort of shed light on some of the things that he was talking about right here.
It's very moving what they do. I have after a point no words to express the work that they're doing. It's not physical labor merely. It's at so many again levels. I have 2 incidents to narrate here. One is from our research when we were doing it. We were in Tavarakere. It was one of those temporary sites that had been opened, and they were doing wood pyre burning there. So the way it happened would be is that the workers come at 6 o'clock in the morning. There are pyres from the previous night which have been burning through the night. So they collect the ashes and the bones and the remains and put it in pots and keep it ready. And families come again around between 8:39 and 11 and collect the pots. And then 11 is the next round of the pyres that start. They start cremating the next for the day at 11. Now we'd gone around 8:30 or 9, in the morning, and they were clearing the pyres, and we went inside where the pyres were. And it's interesting. They put these huge tin sheets, to cover the cremating area and and everything else. And there were these BBMP workers or the Panchayat workers, and said, "Are you sure you want to go in? You don't need to go in. Why don't you call them out?" And we said, "No, we'll go in." And they were quite discouraging of it. From you might get COVID to all kinds of things. So again, like putting it behind a tin sheet and hiding it Again, another way of invisibilizing. We went in there and we saw in a slight distance, there was this pyre from which the workers rolled out, a large chunk of something. And then it was later that we figured out it was a large part of somebody's body which hadn't fully burnt. And they rolled it off the pyre, and then they put it in a gonichila, in a sack, and took it and very respectfully kept it somewhere. They kept it somewhere, and I suppose they will either burn it or bury it. I can't imagine any of us doing something like that. It was done kindly, is what I would say. And then I was thinking that as people who go in with family members who had died, we don't think what's happened to them. We don't think of what the process of burning will be like. They sanitize that process and put it in a pot, and they give it to us, and we take our dead with dignity, and we bring their ashes back with dignity. We are protected in a sense from all that gory things that happens to the body during a cremation, which is what they are doing on behalf of us. I think that is very different from just putting a body on a pyre and burning it, right? It's something else. And then the person there is also saying, we're very careful because there are about 60 bodies a day, and we have tokens, and we have all the pyre slots numbered, and we ensure that people get the ashes of the correct person, and still they suspect and say, are you sure this is our person? And I was thinking, after a point, it's so, our person's ashes, it's ashes at the end of the day. But we're so particular that we want the ashes of the person who was in my family and not somebody else's family. As in, we carry all that emotion and caste and everything even after the person's dead. And we can't let go of that part, forgetting that the person who lit that fire and buried you dead was actually Dalit. Right? So there's this such a, I feel like we're so, like very well said, Shreyas, we are the ones who are not mature enough. We are the ones who get caught up in this pettiness of my person's ashes and my person's bones. So I think that was one example of where we saw how they're taking care. That image of dignity that we have for the person who's died is retained the way it is in our own minds. The second is, that's one example. And then the second is actually a friend who lives in another coastal city, and her mother died of not of COVID, but of old age and chronic illness. But it was just around when unlock just had happened, and things were still iffy, and she had to cremate her mother. So, but she, okay, it's in Bombay. So much of the coastal parts of Bombay is quite dirty, right? It's messy, and so she had to look for a place. And then there were also limitations on where all she could go because of restrictions. And then she was sent off to this place which was very rocky, and so she couldn't just upturn the pot. She had to put her hand in and get the bones and the ashes and put it into the sea. And when she was telling me this, she was saying how, I can't forget how my mother is these bones today, and what happens to the body when it dies and it's either cremated or buried, whatever the case may be. It's been about 10 months actually since her mother's died, but the amount of time it's taking her to get over the fact, just because she had to touch the ashes and the bones and actually feel what her mother had become, right? Now, this is what the crematorium workers and the graveyard workers are doing on behalf of us, right? So that is the nature of care work. That is the emotional work they're doing. It's not about giving them 100 rupees and coming back. It's not that bakshish, which would ever, what do you say, not compensate, but be some kind of recognition of the work, that emotional work, that the graveyard workers are doing on behalf of, all of us, lose our people. I think these two were very poignant and sharp examples, of the kind of work that they do, for us. It's just not a physical labor. It's not breaking stones in a quarry. It's something far more deep, and which is why I think then the connection happens, that somebody calls Sauri Raja back and says, you were telling this person, to take care, and he didn't, and he died. What other reason would there be, if not that emotional connect for somebody to call back, and can give that information? So yeah, I think it's at another order, another level, and that recognition, you can never compensate, and everything is not necessarily compensatable. But if we recognize that, then I don't think we would other them the way they are othered today. If we recognize that this is what they're doing on behalf of us, this is what they're doing to keep the dignity of my loved one for me in my eyes, then I might not do this othering, which so easily, done.
In many ways, you on the one hand see the pettiness of looking for our ashes, or if you're burying your dead, our soil rather than the grave right next, as if these things matter. But on the other hand, you're also confronting in the same society, in the same sort of worlding, and a complete almost equanimity. You have these workers having to exercise for their own survival, or else they would be broken as much as we are when we lose a loved one at the moment where we're burying or cremating our loved one. If they were in the same psychic state as us, they would be at their wits' end too. But it's almost their labor means that they have to sort of almost perform this complete equanimity when they're seeing one body after another being buried or burnt, and they're seeing one family after another weeping and wailing and coming to them and telling these things, right? So I think here's where we get to a sort of tricky question. At various points of Saviraj's testimony, we get an eerie sense, as you mentioned, we just spoke about, that he's inviting us to think about dimensions of his work that we're blind to, mostly because of our caste prejudices, right? And it's almost as if the labor the workers are performing, especially during the ebbs and flows of this pandemic, is not simply about burials or cremations, as you mentioned. It's also a form of laboring that plays a sort of social therapeutic function. It's almost as if the workers are bringing not only sort of material closure to the bodies themselves by converting them into ash or burying them, but they're bringing psychic and sort of spiritual closure even to us, people who've had their lives upended by family members that we've lost, right? So, but our news coverage, and this is something we spoke about as we were preparing for a program, our news coverage, save just one or two exceptions, wholly focused, for instance, on the hardship of priests or pundits, or the benevolence of private volunteers, right? Who are taking the time out of their day to almost do this sort of charity work, this holy work in the case of priests and pundits, right? To assuage our spiritual and psychic loss. But there's complete silence on the fact that the actual people that are doing the majority of this psychic or spiritual closure for us, laboring to do that, are these cemetery workers, or these workers in the burial grounds and these crematoria, right? So what do you think are the ways in which caste blinds us as a society to the real significance of the labor performed by the workers? And you mentioned some of this already in your previous response, but I was just wondering, what is it about caste that prevents us from seeing some of the themes that we've brought out today?
Yeah, it's been very difficult, and that's not to undermine the work, especially of the volunteers who've really stepped in and helped across religions, across communities, and it's not to undermine their work. A lot of my friends have also, done it, so I'm not at all undermining, that work, but it is sometimes infuriating to see how there are articles about in the papers, and you have government officials being grateful and thankful, to them, while when we go to the same government officials and say that they're not getting their minimum wages, then all kinds of hands are tied to this is not our department, to administrative and bureaucratic questions come up, and it's really infuriating actually to hear such a quick, on the one hand, glorification the volunteers and the pundits and the priests, etc., while a very quick and habitual, I will say, dismissing of the rights of the crematorium workers. So I think it is absolutely caste. You're just doing the work of the underbelly of society. And if it wasn't for such fundamental work that they were doing, I don't think the society wouldn't even let them live. But the manual scavengers and the crematorium and graveyard workers are so needed. If they weren't there, then that's it, But if they weren't doing this such inherently necessary work, I don't think, the society would even allow them to, be here. I think that's how bad and pathetic caste system is in all of us, For example, this thing of invisibilizing, sometimes it can be very subtle. There are the gross ways that we've seen. But the subtle ways, and of course, that shows our own little caste bias that we all have. And something that we've got to waken up and become aware of is, for example, like when we did this study, we would think of for example, the people who've lost their loved ones, right? Understanding from the workers' perspective of their rights in terms of wages, living conditions, that is all easy, that we do. But this emotional work that is there is not something that even we see or notice until we spend the time and are there during these tough times, right? Otherwise, what happens is we can look at it from a constitutional point of view. We can look at it as a workers' right point of view, and that happens. That's how we started this report, for example. We was like, what's happening to the workers? But we never think of the emotional. We don't think of the closure that you were talking of. We don't think of that. We are still so trained to only look at the material, part, that we don't even the emotional and the non-material parts are hidden, even to people like us who, activists and workers who do this kind of work. So I think that even we have got to kind of, go beyond the constitutional mandate and the law, and go into that. It takes a certain shift in your own mind and your view of the worker, to go away to an emotional and the other parts of the work they do. So it is difficult. I think these are very tricky emotions, I feel, death and dying. It reminds us of our own impermanence, so we don't want to think of it. So these are very difficult and tricky emotions that we go through when somebody in our life dies, right? And we don't want to deal with messy things. So then we outsource it in a sense to the crematorium workers who do it, on behalf of us. And then we are intact whole people, not having dealt with the messy parts of death and dying. So there is, I think, that for me personally, I will say that it was easy for me to go in and say Samla Sigata, Sigate, that very constitutional, that very materialistic, the very day-to-day thing was something that we did very easily. But it was the other parts that it emerged only because we happened to be there at certain times and see certain things in motion. So I think, how many of us do that? How many of us have that opportunity also, to remember this part of the work they do? And I think caste and the fact that death and dying, when somebody in my family dies, I'm unconsciously reminded of my own death. It's really messy. I don't want to deal with it. I just push it on to somebody else to deal with. I think that contributes to the invisible nature and not concerned. Why would you want to deal with something messy? So why talk about the graveyard worker? Let's sing songs about, the volunteer who went and, took a body. I'm not belittling the work they do, but that is different. And yeah, I see that this is also an added element, to the whole thing.
In many ways, what you spoke about, Swathi, this intactness that we give ourselves when we outsource this labor to the cemetery workers, there's almost a fragility to it. It's not entirely rooted in anything sort of deep for ourselves. So our casteism actually makes us more fragile, I think, in many ways as a society, but also as individuals in ways that we don't recognize. That's why we are ready to commit so much violence in both overt and subtle ways onto folks that do this labor for us, right? So Swathi, based on this conversation we've just had about outsourcing, to keep our sense of self intact, the fragility that lies behind this entire operation, the fragility behind a sort of casteism of our societies. I think a good way to end the conversation would be an important thing to bring up here in our conversation might be that the fact that we have to treat cemetery workers with a sense of dignity, affording them constitutional rights, avenues for social mobility for their children, it's not simply a matter of their upliftment, right? But it's also the only option for our collective survival. And we just got a little taste of this with, this pandemic, which is by no means the worst that our society might suffer in the future. So the pandemic has shown that, it's in such conditions and circumstances that laboring communities enact what Ambedkar famously conceptualized as fraternity, but they enact it for the rest of us. The rest of us are sowing seeds of hatred, division based on religion, based on class, caste, all sorts of gender, all sorts of axes, right? And you see, workers such as cemetery workers, but also care workers such as domestic workers, parakarmikas, actually holding together, not with some inherent capacity, but actually they're doing work. They're learning how to do this work, and they're doing it across generations to hold together our social fabric when, the rest of our society is sort of torn apart by this sort of deadly plague, right? So just to sort of summarize everything we talked about, Swathi, what practical changes in our sort of middle class, even dominant caste perspective needs to happen for us to properly bear witness to, stand in solidarity with, and cultivate a genuine fraternity, to go back to Ambedkar's term, with our city cemetery workers? And what do we risk as a society by failing to make these changes? So in many ways, the question is about, on the one hand, we have to return back to making the constitutional framework work for us, but not simply from the constitutional perspective. We have to bring a deep fraternity to it, right? And what is the risk of not doing that? Not only for the cemetery workers, but for the rest of us, as we will most likely confront even more serious shocks to our society going forward.
Just to also trace back to how fraternity came into the constitution, and we've spoken about it while we were preparing, right, for the recording today, is that Ambedkar also founded his conceptualization of fraternity, and if we were all able to live that way, then that would be a true democracy indeed, is through the Buddhist understanding of Maitri, or loving kindness to everyone. And I think he says it in as many words. He says, there are instances in speeches where he says that this is where he draws the concept of fraternity from. And if you were to look at what he really means, is that everyone, right, that everyone is suffering, and everyone seeks happiness, and can we all be concerned about each other? And here it's not only about, and I think it's an important point that he makes, where he says to be able to see all living beings with love. He's not talking of downtrodden, marginalized. He's not talking of that. He's saying all living beings with love, right? And therein is the equanimity. Therein is the equanimity, because he's not talking of only my kind of people. He's not saying only my kind of people, the Dalit, or the marginalized women, or the people on the fringe of society, but he's saying all living beings. And I think that is something that we have as a society not been able to really internalize. And I might be quite criticized for what I say next, but even among the activists, right? Somebody who is privileged is to be punished. Of course, when you're privileged, you have a role to play, and you have a responsibility additional to those who are not, and to recognize your privilege, and your privilege is available, right, for social change. That is a responsibility we have, no doubt. But this thing of to see all other living beings is something really that the Paura Karmikas and the crematorium workers and all other workers are actually doing. They, when Sauri Raja is talking about these people, he didn't talk about any rich person or poor person or of so and so caste, right? They are themselves not doing that. And it could very well be because that's their job and they don't have the space to do that, right? But if I look at Sauri Raja, and when he says that I wouldn't wish this on my worst enemy, there is something over there. There is something over there there is a compassion over there which is beyond the identity of the person. And I think for us to go out of this identity game, who comes from what background, who represents what, and an acceptance of, and that's what I understand Ambedkar's fraternity to be. It's a sexist word to say brotherhood, but it is a brotherhood that he is, talking of, which encompasses everybody else. So I think for fraternity and for us to get out of the situation that we are in, one is that recognizing that all of us seek the same joys and all of us seek to be away from suffering, right? Which makes us fraternal, because then we're all equal, because we all seek joy and we all want to go away from suffering. That equanimity is, I think, step one. And I think, I mean, truly lived equanimity will also move into deep compassion automatically, because then you care for each other, then your hurt hurts me. And that's what I hear Saudi Raja saying when he says that it's not your relative. In the first interview he says it's not your relative, right? It's not, we don't say somebody's body, right? They all are people we recognize. And that is the deep compassion I see Saudi Raja and others performing, consciously or unconsciously, in the work that they do. If we can learn that compassion and that equanimity from them, I think we would have moved, a step towards greater acceptance of each other. The price we will pay as a society is a price we're paying today, a price that we've already started, collectively living the karma of our deeds. Is it's going to happen if somebody believes in that concept. Is that we're becoming more and more unaccepting of each other. We're living more and more in silos. And I think that's just a price we're all, there's just more and more polarization over more and more access that will just keep on going. And I don't know what the pandemic has also taught us is that everyone's lived off delivery. All the middle class has lived off delivery people, bringing food to their home or groceries to their home. I hope they've realized that they couldn't have done without the delivery people. I'm hoping the pandemic will actually teach us codependency, mutuality, and how we all need each other. And therefore, we can't look at each other at different levels, because we can't do without each other. So I think that's the only way. Equanimity and compassion might sound a little philosophical, but I really don't see any other way that we will be able to go as a society, and which is again inherently there in the fraternity that Ambedkar talks of, because he draws from these concepts of equanimity and compassion. I think if we are able to get there, then I think as a society we'll be able to go forward. I hope that people who are listening to us are not now thinking they have to do charity to the workers, because we very quickly as a society convert any kind of awakening to charity. That's not the intention. The intention, at least where I'm coming from, the intention is for all of us to recognize the work that the workers are doing beyond digging and burning, right? And playing our part in ensuring that they receive what is rightfully theirs as per the constitution and as humanity demands. I think that is at least what I would say is the objective for me to doing that work. And also this podcast is not to have awoke people now going and donating food packets alone in graveyards. I hope that is not the outcome merely of this program.
Well, thank you, Swati. On that note, I think I learned a lot from this conversation and from your research and the research of your colleagues.
Thanks, Shreyas, for going through the report the way you have.
A point, Swati, I just forgot that we were having a conversation for a program, and I wish we could keep going, actually. So my inability to end psychoanalytically, you might be, tuned to this, is also my wish not to end this conversation.
Thank you for hanging in there and listening to the full conversation. If you liked what you heard, do share it with friends and family. You can also leave us a review or rating on iTunes and Apple Podcasts. The crew behind this podcast is Gaurav Krishna on sound supervision and production, with support from S. Sarvanaraj and Raghu Tenkaila. Episode artwork and design is by Chandni Venkataraman. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel on your favorite podcast platform. It can also be accessed on our website, bangaloreinternationalcentre.org. This is Lekha Naidu, signing off on behalf of everyone at BIC.